Good evening. Hello, Frank.
Oh, how are you?
Very, very well. So,
Good.
good evening, everyone, and welcome to another week of 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum of Dublin. Now, our guest this evening is journalist, editor, and author Frank McDonald. So, Frank is joining me to speak about a project that we've been working on together called A Little History of the Future of Dublin, which we have created in partnership with Martello Publishing and the Dublin Port Company. So, Frank, thank you so much for being here.
Not at all. It's my second Zoom conference of the day.
Okay.
I was on to Lüneburg in Germany earlier on with a group of science students who wanted to know how to communicate.
Oh, how wonderful. That has been one of the good things that has come out the last year and a half. We've been able to speak with people anywhere across the world with such ease.
Yeah, brilliant.
But anyway, listen, I have a million and one questions. But Frank, when I was preparing for this evening, a question that I was curious to know the answer to was just a little bit around your own kind of background and motivation. Like, you're someone who you've spent so much of your career writing about and really fighting to protect the best interests of Dublin as a city. And I kind of wonder, when did this motivation start and really what drives you?
Well, I mean, I grew up just off Glenbeigh Road near the Phoenix Park off Black Horse Avenue. And so that was 2 miles from the city centre. And, our parents used to take us to see the sites. I mean, like Dublin Castle, St. Patrick's Cathedral, Christchurch, and other places. And Nelson Pillar, of course, which was still there when I was a kid. And it was threepence to go for kids to go up and sixpence if you were an adult. And I think I'm glad to say that I was up Nelson Pillar numerous times, not just with my parents, but also later on with whenever we had relatives coming to stay or whatever, that I would be deputed to take them on a little tour, and Nelson Pillar was always the high point. So, I kind of grew up with a knowledge of the city that was basically I gained from, going around the place and seeing things. And I suppose it was easier for kids to do that then, I'm not talking about being like tiny babies or anything, but I'm talking about, when you're sort of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that kind of thing. And so, and then I went to UCD after getting out of St. Vincent's in Glasnevin with my leaving cert intact, and then spent 4 years in UCD, and that was a very rare time as well, because it was at the time of the so-called Gentle Revolution, and I was involved in the occupation of the administrative wing of the college in Earlsfort Terrace, in protest basically about them forcing us to go out to Belfield before they even had the library built. I mean, it was only under construction at that stage, and Belfield was like a big building site. So I was aware. I didn't get involved in the Hume Street occupation, oddly enough, but I knew that it was going on and thoroughly approved of it, of course, and took part in other demos as well to do with other issues like South Africa and Vietnam and so on. So when I got into journalism then, basically I suppose there was hardly anybody writing about Dublin at the time, and not in any kind of consistent way, so I just thought this was a seam that I could mine in effect, to just let people know what was going on. And what drew me to it really was the fact that I had started out in the Irish press as a sub-editor, just after coming back from New York, where I had been a freelance correspondent for the Irish press, which was a great thing to be able to do at the age of 22. It was extraordinary chutzpah, really. But anyway, so I came back and they gave me a job as a sub-editor. I didn't even know what a sub-editor was, but all I knew was that the hours, because it was a day, I was working for the Irish press, which was, of course, was a daily newspaper. I was working at night, so you'd go in at 5 o'clock and get off at before midnight, or alternatively you'd go in at 8 o'clock and get off at 4 in the morning. And sometimes, and often I'd be cycling home to where we lived, where the family home, near the Phoenix Park, through this nearly vacant city with nothing but seagulls around the place at that hour of the night. And, you know, I just suddenly, it dawned on me that there were all these derelict sites, you know, and I reckoned that there was a story behind every hoarding, you know, that there was a reason or reasons why all of this was happening. And that one of the things that I aimed to do was to find out what was going on and why the city had become so ruinous in its appearance. So, and that I really got into that then when I joined the Irish Times in 1979. And, you know, basically the first big series of articles that I did was ran for a week, and it was called Dublin, What Went Wrong? And so I was able to delve into doing original research and talking to people and looking up planning files and all sorts of other stuff to find out what was happening. And that was an eye-opener for me and for the people who read the Irish Times, and it became a big thing in a way. And so I won the journalism award for that. And I was really kind of quite overwhelmed in a way. But, you know, like all I had done was do what journalists are supposed to do, is to find out what's going on and tell people about it. And so that's what I've spent my life doing, really. Not just about Dublin, but about the climate and everything else.
But it sounds like you have a genuine curiosity for that knowledge and hunger for it. It's just, sorry, that's something I've been personally looking forward to know the answer to. So thank you for indulging me on that. And I guess in going back to that knowledge, like when we meet the story in The Little History of the Future of Dublin, you know, one of the first quotes that you have pretty early on in the book is you quote Maurice Craig describing the arrival of the Renaissance in 1662 through the arrival of the Duke of Ormond. And he's someone that you talk about as being very significant in the city story. You might just talk to me a little bit about his legacy.
Well, I mean, it's, you know, there's what Maurice Craig wrote really was basically saying that if the fall of Constantinople could be regarded as in 1453 could be regarded as the ushering in of the modern era, that its impact was bound to be felt in Ireland at some point. And so it was that when James, Duke of Ormond, stepped out of his pinnace onto the sands of Dublin Bay, the Renaissance, in a word, had arrived in Ireland. It was July the 27th in the year 1662. What a great line, you know, to put a date on it all. And the reason why it was so important was because Ormond had spent the Cromwellian years in exile with the court of King Charles II after the execution of his father, in Charles I in 1649. And most of the time they spent in Paris. And, you know, the Duke of Ormond, he was one of the butlers of Kilkenny. And he was just one of those, he was really impressed by the quays of the Seine and by the new Hôtel des Invalides, which had been built for old soldiers who were wounded or maimed or whatever. And so when he came back to Ireland as Viceroy in 1662, he basically said, look, we can't have this business of buildings being built with their backs to the river. We've got to create quays, you know, and he decreed basically that they should start laying out the Liffey quays. And that's one of the reasons why, it is the main reason why, the longest single stretch of the Liffey quays are named Ormond Quay Upper and Ormond Quay Lower in honor of the Duke of Ormond. And that was one of his great legacies to the city. And the other one was that he bought the initial amount of land that came to be the core of what was developed as the Phoenix Park, which was essentially a royal deer park surrounded by a wall, but with gates to allow public access. And his third great legacy to Dublin was the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham, which is the most important, by far the most important late 17th century civil building in Ireland, and one of the most important in this part of the world.
It's amazing. And then when you're talking about, as you mentioned, say Upper and Lower Ormond Quay are remembering his contribution, then we've other early improvers to the city who are remembered. Gosh, Sir Humphrey Jervis, Luke Gardner. Is there anyone who has not yet been remembered for the contribution or for the scale of their contribution to the city in that sense?
I've tried to remember them all in the book, and they deserve to be celebrated because, I suppose the key thing really was that it wasn't until the 1660s and after that Dublin came to be consciously planned as Ireland's capital city. And previously, don't forget, Kilkenny for a time was the capital of Ireland, and other places too, perhaps. So, Dublin, they started planning the city, and the city really was a medieval area around Christchurch and the castle. And it gradually expanded in a very haphazard kind of way. So what they did really was to put shape on all of that, and to put shape on and to lay down the ground rules for the eastward extension of the city towards the bay. And that started very early on in the 1680s, while the Duke of Ormond was still the Viceroy. And it continued on then with the Jervis estate, and then later on with the Gardner estate on the north side, the creation of the first great Georgian street in Dublin, Henrietta Street, long neglected, subsequently, but really amazing. It must have been incredible at the time, lined with these town mansions that look very plain on the front, but when you go in, some of them have the most extravagant plasterwork, and it's just such a revelation. I always remember the first time I ever went into a Georgian house and saw the splendor of it all behind the brick walls on the front. And it was just wonderful stuff. And then Gardner came up with the idea of creating what became known as Gardner's Mall on Sackville Street. Sackville Street itself was his creation, and in the center of it there was this promenade that high society in its day, and this from the 1750s onwards, used to congregate and walk up and down there and display their finery and all the rest of it. So O'Connell Street, it became O'Connell Street later on, but the bones of it were laid down by Luke Gardner way back then. And then his son, also called Luke, developed Mountjoy Square, which is one of the great Georgian squares. And then of course you had this whole problem of the north side versus the south side eventually merged. And whereas Georgian Dublin had started in the north side, it was in the south side that it really caught on in a way. And and as Maurice Craig said way back when he wrote Dublin 1660 to 1860, as long ago as 1952, was described the Merrion Square area as by far the better part of Dublin, of historic Dublin, and indeed it's still valued, not just for the park but the houses as well. But sadly the houses are no longer lived in. All of these houses, you've got to remember, were lived in. Then you've got the great public buildings that were produced, the not just the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham, but later on the forecourts and the Custom House, City Hall, which was built as the Royal Exchange in about 1770. And then the Wide Streets Commissioners, who were fantastic. There were people on the Wide Streets Commissioners who were probably making loads of money out of what was going on. But on the other hand, they were following a plan that really made sense and that gave Dublin a classical grandeur, such that anybody who arrived in the city by boat from England or from Wales by the year 1800, they would have been just stunned by how beautiful Dublin was. It was one of the most splendid cities in Europe. And by that stage, it already had a population of 200,000, which makes it really quite substantial in European terms at the time. So, what they created was just really without parallel in the history of Ireland. And and one of the finest pieces of town planning in Europe. And in fact, you've got to remember that when the Wide Streets Commissioners was set up in 1757, that was 100 years before Haussmann remade Paris.
Of course,
100 years. We were way ahead of the posse in that regard.
And do we know what their articulated vision was against what they ultimately went on to create?
Well, I mean, I think that they had a very clear vision of what they were doing, and Gardner didn't build all. I mean, he parceled up lots. The great estates parceled up lots, saying you have to, you can build here, but you have to build a building that's 5 stories high and it stands over a basement, and you would have railings in front and steps leading up to the entrance, and then after that you could do what you wished in terms of the interior decoration and all the rest of it. So there was really it was a vision of creating a great capital city, and of course at that stage it had its own parliament, and the parliament building, designed by Edward Lovett Pearce, was I think it was finished in about 1730, which is extraordinary when you look at it. And that's the center part of it, the curved colonnades on either side, and the porticos, the House of Lords portico and the other one on Foster Place were added later. But that was just a tremendous building in its day. And at that stage, there were the houses that would have lined Dame Street and College Green would have been called Dutch Billies after King William of Orange, because they were those timber framed houses that had gable fronts and were much smaller in scale, more like Amsterdam than Georgian Dublin. And most of them then were subsequently demolished in succeeding decades, unfortunately, including the wonderful places like Chamber Street in the Liberties, and that whole kind of Huguenot weaver colony in effect that grew up there. There's very little trace of that left. So it's there was a very clear idea of what was going to happen, and even after the Act of Union, I mean, yes, the Act of Union was a setback for Ireland and for Dublin, but even after that, there was still loads of things built. Like Nelson Pillar was built in 1807. The GPO was built in 1817. The Pro Cathedral in Marlborough Street was built around the same time as that too. And there were lots of other things, and including, of course, and you can never forget this because it was such a remarkable achievement, even before the Act of Union, you had the Great South Wall to protect Dublin Port. And that was really one of the most, I think, the most singular engineering achievement of its day. And that then was followed up in the 1820s and 30s by the construction of this relief harbour or a refuge harbour in Dunleary, because there have been a lot of ships running aground and in storms. So they decided to build a refuge harbour so that they could nip into Dunleary to keep safe during the storm. And that was built using granite, which was quarried in Dalkey and taken down to the site on a funicular railway. I mean, the first actual railway in Ireland, long predating the creation of the first passenger railway line, which was Dublin to Kingstown, from Western Road to Kingstown. Dunleary used to be.
Sorry, the passenger railway was the 1830s, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, and talk to me a little bit about that, just in terms of how we as a city, be it a central city or a suburb or suburbs, have evolved through the changes in transport.
Yeah, of course, because Dublin in the past would have been a very tight place. I mean, the Georgian city was your original 15-minute city, in the sense that you could walk from the core of the city to its extremity in 15 minutes. So it was really that area between the two canals, pretty much. And it only then began expanding along the route of the railway line, and then later on along the routes of the tram lines, so that you ended up then with suburbs like Blackrock, Dunleary itself. I mean, Dunleary became a seaside resort for a time as well, and before Bray ever caught on. And then on the north side, you have places like Clontarf and Drumcondra, and so on. And all of these were served with tram lines, and that enabled people to do something that hitherto was impossible, which was they could live much further away from where they worked, because previously they would have walked to work mostly, and now they were able to get a tram or a train or an omnibus, a horse-drawn omnibus, which predated the trams. So, you know, it led to a suburban explosion. And in a way, you know, that part of that was driven by the fact that increasingly parts of the city, the inner city, were becoming, the Georgian houses were being turned into tenements, and there was a lot of poor people there. And in a way, it was kind of like the flight of the middle class out of the inner city and to the suburbs, which was something that really happened since there was a middle class in this city.
And because, like, when we're talking about, I guess when we're talking about circumstances like that, it brings me to think about money. And, you know, you devote a certain amount of attention in the book to speaking about the Celtic Tiger, but also talking about the property crash as well.
Oh, yes.
And I guess kind of thinking around and kind of talking about that more broadly, I wonder what you would personally believe to be the best or the worst, or best and the worst outcomes from that time.
Well, I mean, you know, like I remember the boom. You know, I had this kind of, it seemed a bit surreal to me at the time. You know, like there was nothing, seemed to be nothing as bad as, you know, there was so much money sloshing around the place, and we didn't seem to know what to do with it. And you know, everything was lavish, and then suddenly it all came crashing down after 2008, and you know, we were then left in a situation where we had this city, we had, you know, all the new suburbs that had been created, you know, going back to the 20s and 30s, from Marino, Crumlin, Finglas, Ballyfermot, Cabrif, and all of that. And then and we also had the wonderful inner city flat complexes, which, you know, some of which suffered from severe social problems, but nobody could deny that they were beautifully designed when they were built at the time. And so we had, I suppose, in a way, the recession that followed the crash enabled us to take stock, you know, of what were important things that needed to be done. And one of the things that happened was that Dublin City Council's planners produced a you know, really very ambitious and very generous apartment design standards. And the whole idea was to try and encourage as many people as possible to move back into the inner city, and in particular the city centre area, so that there would be enough people living here to sustain the place. And you know, and unfortunately what happened was that the construction industry was on its knees, and you know, ministers then were rushing, you know, to kind of help them out in a way by Alan Kelly was Minister for Housing, the Environment at the time, and he was in charge of housing and planning, and he was the first one to issue mandatory ministerial guidelines essentially aimed at reducing apartment design standards, so that to make the apartments more viable for the construction industry to build. And that was the first straw in the wind as to what was going to happen later on, which is something really very disturbing, which is that, you know, like since the inauguration of planning in Ireland in the 20th century, with this 1963 Planning Act and its subsequent, the Major Planning Act of 2000 as well, that, you know, they enshrined the whole idea of every city having a plan, you know, and so, you know, every local authority had to prepare its own plan, and then set about implementing it. And Dublin had its plan, and other cities and towns around the country did too, and counties as well. And and that those city and county plans were really, like the Supreme Court said in 1991, were kind of like a contract between the local authority on the one hand and the people that it represented on the other hand, saying this is what we're proposing for your area and so on. And everyone could have their inputs into this and everything else. But the mandatory ministerial guidelines have really upended that whole system by essentially supposed fast track route to on board Planola directly, with large schemes of housing of more than 100 units or more. And then you had the further dumbing down of apartment design standards by Owen Murphy, and then the building height guidelines that came in also in 2018, which required local authorities to promote high-rise construction, which I thought was a mistake, because I think one of the great things about Dublin is that it has not lost its human scale, and that the city isn't peppered in the way that Manchester is now, and parts of London, with random eruptions of high-rise buildings all over the place. And I know there's people who say, well, if we build high-rise buildings, that means we'll be able to accommodate more people, and more people then could live in the inner and so forth. That's true. But you've got to also remember that high-rise buildings are much more expensive to build per square meter, because you've got to provide extra fire safety precautions and other things to cater for more lifts, for example, and things like that raise the cost. So that, like I always think of central Paris, and Paris is a city that I know better than most in the world. And it's one of my favorite places. And there are 2.2 million people living in central Paris. And most of them are living in buildings that are no more than 5 to 7 stories high. Even the ones that Haussmann decreed to be built are 7 to 8 stories high. So, there's no need for, random high-rise eruptions, especially if the entire building is going to be, or the entire complex is going to be a build-to-rent scheme, which is essentially, a great thing for investors and the people who are putting money into these places, but not so great if you've got to pay $3,000 a month in rent for a 2-bedroom flat.
Yeah, no, yes, very much so. But I guess, this conversation about, needing to meet housing demands for the population in a way that is kind of reasonable and practicable for the city is something that's recurring. Like, it's kind of in the book you reference, kind of reports being published back in 1922 that were talking about this exact same sentiment. Yes. And I guess my question is, in your opinion, what can we be doing today and tomorrow? Like, what's the right step towards the solution?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be said is that the current Dublin City Plan is undergoing a review, and is even as I speak, is out for consultation, and that everybody who wants to see improvements carried out in their own areas, or who are concerned to protect, for example, buildings that they think are of significance, or a street that needs to be traffic calmed, or whatever, anything and everything is in the city plan. And so this is an opportunity for people to get involved. But if that consultation is to be meaningful, you cannot have a situation where the city plan can simply be overturned at will by On Board Planola and overridden as a result of having these mandatory ministerial guidelines. So the first thing that I would do, if I was in charge, is to abolish all of those mandatory ministerial guidelines and to just revert to having planning guidelines, which local authorities have to have regard to, but aren't necessarily required to obey to the letter. Because that still leaves the initiative at the local level. Whereas the other thing is really top-down planning. In other words, you do this or else, and that's not the way to do it. And I think that that's one of the reasons why there's been such enormous opposition from local communities to some of these high-rise build-to-rent schemes. I'm thinking particularly of Clonliffe College, for example, where there's a plan, An Bord Pleanála has approved it, despite the fact that there were dozens and dozens of objections, including from local public representatives, councillors, TDs, and residents, and so on. And that scheme consists of 1,600 units, of which 71% would be one-bedroom or studio apartments. And that, to me, and okay, they will have some communal amenities, and there will be the residue of the parkland and all the rest of it. But at the same time, that's not the basis, I don't think, for the creation of sustainable residential communities in an urban context. So that we really have to think twice about all of that, and that scheme, by the way, includes an 18-story tower, which, again, are we going to end up with a whole rash of these around the place? Are we going to lose the scale of the city? One of the essential things that makes it so attractive and so appealing. And one of the things that I was determined to try and avoid is the idea that Dublin could become an anywhere city, and I don't think we want to see that. I don't think people want to see that, and I think that the vast majority of people, would be much happier if the human scale of the city was preserved in some way.
And I guess picking up on that, like, what do you hope, or what do you believe our city and our skyline are going to look like 50, 100 years from now?
Well, I have no idea. God knows what it's going to be like. I mean, one of the issues that I did mention, of course, in the book is that, Dublin is a coastal city, and therefore, it is obviously in the front line in relation to rising sea levels as a result of climate change. And that is something that, could have seriously catastrophic implications for certain areas of the city, particularly those on the coast like Sandymount and Clontarf and Sutton in particular, and also Rush in North County Dublin, which are all very exposed to the sea. So if sea levels do rise in the way that it's predicted over the next 50 years, then some of these places are going to become unsustainable unless we devise some measures to protect them against storm surges and all the rest of it. But that's a problem that, let's not forget that the vast majority of major cities in the world are located in coastal areas because they grew up on the riverbanks, and therefore they're generally close to the sea. And so they're all in the same boat in relation to this. And it's not something that can be predicted easily. But clearly measures will have to be taken to strengthen flood defenses over time. And, I always think that, instead of building concrete walls, that maybe we should follow the example of Waterford, which I mentioned, where there's a new flood defense wall on the quay in Waterford, but it's made from toughened glass in a steel frame with a wooden rail on top, and it looks absolutely, you could see through it into the shore. And that seems to me to be the kind of visionary kind of thing to do, rather than just to build a concrete wall that's going to be 1 meter high or 2 meters high or whatever the hell. We do have threats that need to be dealt with, and how these are dealt with is going to test us, I think.
And I think another threat that we are, every person fortunate enough to be alive today is facing is the circumstance of COVID-19 that we're all living through. And you do talk, and it's an amazing thing to be able to, for a museum like us who generally deals with something after the fact, to be involved in creating something that is talking about the present day was an interesting novelty in and of itself. But you do write about the present day. You do think about and talk about some of the impacts that COVID might have here in Dublin.
Well, I think the thing that the pandemic really revealed was the vacancy of the city centre. And that whole thing about, I live in Temple Bar, and it was just became surreal. There was hardly anybody around. The population just seemed to have disappeared. All of the hospitality outlets were closed, of course. So it was much quieter, but it was a surreal kind of quietness. It wasn't. I just thought it was a bit eerie, really. So I'm not saying that I longed for the streets to be thronged with revelers, as they frequently had been in the past. But on the other hand, there's some balance needs to be struck as well. And I think that one of the notable things is that, the inner city had a population of 250,000 roughly in 1926. And that fell to about 84,000 in 1991. And as a result of urban renewal and, the provision of more housing in the city, particularly in areas like Temple Bar and Docklands, but other parts of the inner city as well, the area's population went up to about 132,000 by 2011. And whereas some of that has been, chewed away by Airbnb and illegal conversions of homes into tourist accommodation, it is something that we really need to build on, and I think that, for example, why shouldn't we say, set a target for having 250,000 people living within the canals, by say 2030, and just work to ensure that that happens. And I'm not just talking about, like building huge blocks of flats necessarily, but, if you walk around the streets of Dublin, I always say to people, look up, don't just look into the windows of the shop, look up at what's upstairs, what's on top, what's on the upper floors. And frequently you find that a lot of the upper floors are vacant, or they're in substandard office use, or they're used for storage or whatever. And I think, it would be just brilliant for, Dublin City Council to set up a one-stop shop where aimed at ensuring the renovation of buildings like that for residential use on the upper floors, that would make a major contribution. And that could be done, it doesn't require big developers. That can be done on a building by building basis by small contractors, who, if one could clear the hurdles that currently exist in relation to fire regulations and other constraints, that is something that really could change the picture enormously. And in fact, it would, there's no question about it. And that would then help to sustain the businesses in town as well, that you wouldn't necessarily need loads and loads of tourists. Because I think Paul Kearns, a former senior planner in Dublin City Council, was quite correct when he said that Dublin had made a bet on tourism, that tourism was more important. And that's one of the reasons why there's been a rake of hotels built in the last 10 years. It's extraordinary the number of new hotels in the city, and there's still more planned. And, and you just think, every time I hear about a planning application for another hotel, I just think, oh my God, there goes another site that could have been developed for apartments, for people to live in. And that should be our first priority. And also, all of those apartments, whatever new apartments are built, they shouldn't be exclusively for renting. They should include an element of owner occupation so that people can buy and then develop a stake in the particular areas where they live. And I know this myself from Temple Bar, that it's the people who own their own homes are the most active in seeking the betterment and improvement of the area, because we do have a personal stake in it. And that's something that, I've been very privileged in a way to live here over the last 26 years. And it's really flown, there's no doubt about it. But yes, we have problems, and yes, we need to be careful, and yes, we need to keep a lookout about what's going on to make sure that we're not walked all over by the publicans, who, as one of my fellow residents described it, the oligarchs of Temple Bar. And we need to try and make sure that the place doesn't lose any sense of balance. And I'm not just talking about drunks in the street.
Yeah, it's a funny one, because it's kind of like when you talk about the focus on tourism, like we as an industry are so kind of desperately enthusiastic, shall we say, for the kind of meaningful return of tourism as a sector. But then the flip side of that is, if we got to the point during my lifetime where, as you say, you walked down central city streets and you looked up and you saw bright lights, homes, families, lives, it would be a privilege to see.
And I mean, like when you walk, walk around the Georgian core on the south side in particular, and like how many people are actually living in Marion Square? I would say it's no more than half a dozen. Most of those houses are in office use. The same is true of Fitzwilliam Square, and many of the Georgian streets, Bagot Street Lower, for example. Full of Georgian houses, but there's hardly anybody living in Bagot Street. And there used to be people living there. I know people who grew up in Bagot Street. So, it's not impossible. These things can be done. And I don't think that Georgian houses are really great office buildings, because I suppose you're running up and down the stairs all the time, and so on. And I mean, like, I've seen magnificent conversions done of Georgian houses. I cited the example of number 3 Henrietta Street, which is, which was in such rag order. You couldn't imagine how it could be restored. And yet that was taken on by Ian Lumley and Pat Wrigglesworth, and they turned it into 7 really superb corporate-let apartments in that house, and restored the exterior of it as well. And it's just wonderful, and it just shows what can be done. And I would like to see that replicated, not for corporate shortlets now, but I mean for people to live in on a permanent basis in Georgian Dublin. And that's what we should have. We should have that as a kind of a slogan. Let's have 250,000 people living in the inner city by 2030.
Yeah, well,
it's possible thereafter. Why not?
Why not?
And then we would have the 15-minute city. That's not talked about, by the planners and others, and of course by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who is really pushing out the boat for cyclists and city living. Yeah,
well, I guess as someone who spends so much of her time in a particularly special Georgian townhouse, there is nothing more privileged than being in these surroundings. And so I think it sounds like a KPI or a goal that would be quite incredible if it was accomplished. But I think kind of looking kind of slightly, I guess stepping back a little bit, in the kind of latter pages of the book, you do talk about this idea that, we have had an influx of kind of tech giants, but then we also have different initiatives running throughout the city, such as Smart Dublin, that's looking at kind of future-proofing the city through kind of finding solutions to challenges. Then the Smart Docklands, which again is looking at climate issues. So absolutely, technology is going to have a key role at the heart of Dublin's future. But in a similar vein to what you've been talking about in terms of city Georgian living, you do talk about the fact that there is a tension between, the influx of technology and developers and the changes that we're going through with the need to preserve the cultural and kind of architectural heritage of the city.
Yeah.
And how do we address that challenge? How do we face into that challenge best?
Well, I mean, I think this, the tech sector, the biggest problem is the proliferation of data centers, which are going to chew up electricity in Ireland and increase the country's carbon footprint enormously. I don't deny that big tech has played a major role in the creation of, like we used to call it the Grand Canal Docks. Now it's called Google Docks, for goodness sake. Or, you know, the new Amazon headquarters that's materializing in Charlemagne Street, or the big Facebook European headquarters that replaced, sadly, replaced the AIB Bank Centre opposite the RDS in Marion Road. So you know, like you know, it seems to me that the tech people will that they kind of will walk all over us unless we're careful, you know, and the government really needs to stop rolling out red carpets all over the place for data centers in particular, because I think that the idea that we're going to have to build another 4 gas-fired power stations just to satisfy their electricity demand, in effect, is just crazy, kind of, you know, when we need to be getting out of fossil fuels. And the sooner we do that, the better, you know. But, you know, the tech crowd, that whole thing about, you know, Richard Florida's book, the American pop sociologist who wrote a book about 20 years ago, The Rise of the Creative Class, talked about how, you know, cities need to, you know, market themselves, or to create the kind of places that highly mobile tech workers are going to be attracted to. And that involves, you know, the inevitable cappuccino bars and, you know, all the rest of it, you know, trendy nightclubs and whatever else. And I'm not sure that I ever went along with that thesis, really. I always thought that there was something glib about it, and in fact, Florida himself has changed his mind about it and says, I think I went over the top, you know, in you know, suggesting or canvassing the idea of remaking cities to cater for this class of mobile, highly mobile, well-paid international workers. And, you know, I think we, like tourism, we've put too many eggs in that basket, and we need to, I suppose, pull back from it a bit, and consider, for example, you know, what's to be the future of what used to be the designated digital hub area in the Liberties up in Thomas Street, near Guinness's brewery, and what's going to happen to the land that Guinness is going to divest itself of. You know, is that going to be more build to rent towers and whatever else, or is there going to be some new development model devised? You know, at the moment, that's the only show in town. I mean, 95% of all of the apartments that have been built here in the last couple of years are built to rent. And we need to have a mix of everything. And I think that the state has a major role to play, because the state, or through various state agencies and directly on its own account, the state owns an awful lot of land. I mean, you think of, for example, Cahill Barracks in Rathmines. You know, is that really needed? You know, we have to ask ourselves, you know, should we not do the same to Cahill Barracks in Rathmines as we did to Clancy Barracks in Island Bridge? You know, turn it into a residential neighborhood, you know, and that's like just a mile or so from, it's just across the canal, from the city, from the inner city. So, you know, it's those kind of things that offer opportunities. And the fact that the land is owned by the state means that, you know, that if you own the land, that gives you control. And like the most important thing that we need to do is to make housing affordable, and to build affordable housing that younger people can buy. I mean, I've said before, and I say it again, I was 25 when I bought my first house in Dublin, and it was in Harold's Cross, and it wasn't a little cottage either. It was a 4-bedroom end of terrace Edwardian house. And I got that for, I mean, it was cheap as chips, 12,500 Irish pounds on a standard salary from the Irish press with a mortgage from the EBS. And there's almost nobody of that age in Dublin who could do anything like that or even dream about doing anything like that. So I think, and I've said this in the book, I think that we've betrayed the younger generation and that we need to make it up to them by dealing with the fundamental issue that's wrong with housing, which is essentially a crisis of affordability. It isn't just about supply, it's about affordability. And whether people are going to be able to buy or indeed rent homes at reasonable prices. And that's something that is really a matter for the government to sort out. But unfortunately, the present government and its predecessor has put all of its faith in the so-called wall of money that's available abroad for investment in Irish property, and that is leading us down a blind alley.
And I think what I'm hearing and what you're saying is ultimately it's a need to focus on the human and the community and just be inherently decent to that. Yeah. But I guess, listen, I would very happily sit here for the next 5 hours and keep asking you questions, and I'm just mindful of the time. I think as a closing question, I guess in bookending my own curiosities this evening, Frank, what's your favorite building in the city and why?
God, I'd have to think about that. I really would. I think in the city itself, I think the most impressive building, especially at night, is the Custom House. You know, it really has. I mean, I'm sorry that they had to build a flood defense wall on City Quay, but that when you came out of Tara Street Station, you know, you could see right across to the Custom House, and it was floodlit, and it just looked like some, you know, really fantastic Venetian palazzo, you know, on the other side of the river with the water lapping against the quay. And then, you know, in modern buildings or more contemporary buildings, I still have a soft spot for Liberty Hall, which of course is nearly beside the Custom House. And I live in hope that, you know, it will one day be restored to what it was when it was first built in 1965, and when we all thought, oh my goodness, isn't this great? You know, like it's such a symbol of you know, the emergence of modern Ireland. And also the Bossaurus, which predates Liberty Hall, you know, which is, there's a renovation program for Bossaurus now, and I hope that they have the sense, I mean, Dermot Bannon is involved in it, among others, as on the architectural team. And I hope they keep as much as possible of the original features of the building, and that they reinstate some that are missing. Like, for example, a lot of people, some older people would certainly remember the Ablana Theatre that used to be in the basement of Bossaurus. And when that was opened first in the 1950s, the early 1950s, it was a newsreel cinema that you could go into, and while you were waiting on your bus to Cavan or wherever, and you could watch the newsreel, the Pathé newsreel stuff on a kind of like a continuous loop, and things like that. I mean, you know, we have such a great collection of really important buildings in Dublin, and you know, yes, most of them are owned by the state and they're being looked after and so on. You know, but I think of the Newcomen Bank, the former Dublin Corporation Rates Office on the corner of Castle Street and Lord Edward Street, and just opposite City Hall. I mean, that needs to be restored and opened up to the public, and it has the most fantastic elliptical staircase, which is one of those cantilevered ones where, you know, you really have to suspend disbelief as you walk up or down the stairs. But you know, and really all of the Georgian stuff and some of the Victorian stuff as well, and also, you know, a lot of contemporary architecture. I mean, I'm quite pleased about how some of what's been built in Dawson Street, for example, the new building that the Ivy restaurant is on the ground floor of. I think that has given a lift to Dawson Street and is quite very respectful of its context. And would that the architects who designed that, HJL, would show the same consideration in relation to residential buildings instead of, you know, churning out things like the proposal for the Blair Wills site on South Circular Road, where you're going to end up with a tower in the middle of it, which would be actually taller than Liberty Hall. And that just seems to me to be just grossly disproportionate. You know, I mean, I think that would be a terrible thing if we took that turn down that road and ended up looking like anywhere else.
And I think that is a perfectly natural point to call close on this evening tonight. I think we in the Little Museum, I know we feel so fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with you on this project, Frank, and sincerely.
And it's all Trevor's idea. We blame him for it. He came up with the idea of having an exhibition on the theme, A Little History of the Future of Dublin. And he asked me, would I write an essay? And as I said at the book launch a few weeks ago, you know, the essay turned into a book, and I owe it to Martello, Edwin Hegel, and everyone at Martello for their being so for taking on the publication at such a tight schedule. And I'm just amazed and kind of gobsmacked that the book is out, and I just hope people enjoy it and take something from it and tell their friends about it as well.
Yes, please. Well then, I guess, as you say, let's blame Trevor, and let's thank yourself, Martello, and then the Dublin Port Company who collectively made it possible. Yeah. So the book is A Little History of the Future of Dublin. To everyone who's been here with us today, thank you so much for taking the time. The book remains available in the Little Museum shop and all good bookstores. But for now, this is it for another 120 Dublin Stories, and indeed the last of 2021. So to Santa Rita for making this possible, sincerely, thank you so much. And Frank McDonald for joining me. I really appreciate it, and good evening.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Cheers.
Bye.